I am George, 72 years old, and somehow still reeling from the betrayal my stepfamily inflicted. As a retired tech investor who built wealth quietly over decades, I had escaped notice but maintained close family bonds. Last Tuesday, they gathered at our family home after Martha's funeral. Between coffee and leftover casseroles, my daughter-in-law Victoria leaned forward smirking. "You know, George, you're lucky we even let you stay this long. Charity goes a long way." I simply sipped my coffee and nodded. That night, I called my lawyer Harold and activated financial plans I'd kept secret for 15 years. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Living in Westchester County, New York, meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling Tudor home with its 3-car garage and manicured gardens, family dynamics had always been complicated. Martha's children from her first marriage never quite accepted me as anything more than their mother's second choice. When I married Martha 18 years ago, I was a 54-year-old widower with a modest consulting business and what everyone assumed were modest savings. Martha was a beloved elementary school teacher, recently divorced, struggling to raise 3 teenagers on her own. Paul was 15, Linda was 17, and Ronald was already in college. To them, I was the older man who'd swooped in to provide stability their absent father never could. What they didn't know was that my first wife's death in a car accident 7 years earlier had left me with substantial life insurance payouts and a growing portfolio of tech investments I'd started in the 1980s. By the time I met Martha, I was worth over $20 million. But I kept that information private, preferring to let people see me as a simple consultant who'd gotten lucky in love. Martha knew about my financial situation, of course. She was the one who suggested we keep it quiet. "Let the kids see you as their stepfather, not as a meal ticket," she'd said. "If they're going to love you, let it be for who you are, not what you have." It seemed like good advice at the time. Martha wanted her children to build their own lives, earn their own success, without depending on inherited wealth. So for 18 years, I played the role of the modest provider. I let Martha pay for household expenses from her teaching salary and pension, while I quietly funded everything else through carefully disguised transfers. The mortgage payments, property taxes, home improvements, family vacations, even the kids' college tuition. All of it came from my accounts, but in ways that looked like Martha's careful budgeting and my small consulting income. The deception wasn't difficult to maintain. I worked from a home office managing investments and business dealings that generated substantial returns. To the family, I was just George who works with computers and occasionally traveled for mysterious consulting gigs. They saw me as harmless, probably grateful to have found financial security through marriage to their mother. Paul grew up to become a middle manager at an insurance company, married Victoria 4 years ago, and seemed content with his predictable suburban life. Linda became a nurse, married her high school sweetheart, and lived 20 minutes away with their 2 young children. Ronald moved to California, worked in marketing, and visited twice a year with updates about his startup ambitions that never quite materialized. They were good kids, really. Maybe not ambitious or particularly driven, but decent people who loved their mother and tolerated me with varying degrees of warmth. Paul was always polite but distant. Linda made genuine efforts to include me in family gatherings. Ronald treated me like a friendly acquaintance who happened to live with his mother. The problem started when Victoria entered the picture. Paul's wife was ambitious in ways that Paul wasn't, and she had very clear ideas about family hierarchies and financial priorities. She worked in real estate, so she was constantly calculating property values and inheritance potential. From our first meeting, she made it clear that she saw me as an obstacle to her family's financial advancement. "Paul's mother is such a saint, supporting you all these years," she'd say with a smile that never reached her eyes. "It must be nice to have that kind of security in your golden years." The implication was always clear. I was a dependent, a burden, someone who'd married into comfort rather than earning it. Victoria had strong opinions about elder care, about appropriate living situations for seniors, about the importance of family assets being preserved for the next generation. She spoke often about friends whose elderly relatives had done the right thing by moving into assisted living facilities, freeing up family homes for younger families who could really use the space. I listened to these comments for 4 years, watching Victoria slowly influence Paul's perspective, seeing her plant seeds of resentment about my presence in what she clearly considered her future inheritance. Martha noticed it too, but she believed family relationships could weather these tensions. "They'll understand when they're older," she'd say. "Right now they're just young and worried about money. Once they're more established, they'll appreciate what we've built together." Martha died believing her children would honor our marriage and treat me with respect. She had no idea what they were planning. The Hampton Inn on Route 9 became my temporary base of operations. Not exactly the Four Seasons, but it had reliable Wi-Fi room service, and most importantly, complete anonymity. I checked in under my full name, George William Thompson, and paid cash for a week. The desk clerk barely glanced at me. Just another senior citizen probably visiting family or attending a funeral. Perfect. The first call I made was to Harold Steinberg. Harold had been my attorney for 20 years, but more than that, he'd been the architect of my financial privacy. Not that anyone in Martha's family knew about our relationship, of course. They assumed I was just the stepfather with a simple will and basic banking needs. "George," Harold's voice carried genuine sympathy when he answered. "I heard about Martha. My condolences. She was a remarkable woman." "Thank you, Harold. I need to see you tomorrow if possible." "Of course. 10 a.m. at my office. Actually, could we meet somewhere else? Somewhere private?" There was a pause. Harold had known me long enough to read between the lines. "The family's giving you trouble already." Something like that. "I'll come to you. Text me the address." Harold arrived the next morning carrying his familiar leather briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who'd dealt with greedy relatives more times than he cared to count. I'd ordered coffee from the hotel restaurant, a small luxury that would have raised eyebrows if anyone had been watching my spending habits. "How bad is it?" Harold asked, settling into the room's single armchair. I told him about the previous night. About Victoria's demands, about being told to find appropriate housing, about how they'd dismissed me as someone who'd never contributed anything meaningful. Harold's jaw tightened as I spoke. "Do they have any idea about your actual financial situation?" "None whatsoever. Martha and I kept our agreement. They think she supported me all these years." "And you're sure you want to proceed as we discussed?" I looked out the hotel window at the parking lot, filled with ordinary cars, driven by ordinary people living ordinary lives. Yesterday, those people would have seen me as one of them. Just another elderly widower, probably struggling with fixed income concerns and uncertain about his housing future. They had no idea that the man in room 237 owned more real estate than most of them could imagine. "I'm sure. How long will it take?" Harold opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "The preliminary documentation can be filed within 48 hours. The complete asset restructuring will take about 2 weeks. And George, there's no way they can contest any of it. Everything has been legally yours for over a decade." Martha transferred her share years before her illness precisely to avoid situations like this. I nodded, feeling that cold satisfaction settle deeper into my bones. "What about the house?" "That's where it gets interesting." Harold allowed himself a small smile. "Technically, you could evict them today, but I assume you have something more educational in mind. I want them to show me exactly who they are first. Let them get comfortable in my house, making their plans, dividing up what they think is theirs. Give them enough rope to hang themselves with their own assumptions. And then I'll remind them that assumptions can be very expensive things." While Harold explained procedures and confirmed details, I thought about Victoria back at the house. She was probably going through Martha's closet right now, deciding which clothes were worth keeping. She was probably calling contractors about renovations, maybe even researching how to remove my name from utility bills. She thought she'd won. She thought the inconvenient stepfather was out of the way, leaving the family free to claim their inheritance. She had no idea that she'd just declared war on someone who'd been preparing for this battle longer than she'd been part of this family. My phone buzzed with a text from Paul. "Hope you found a nice place, George. Victoria's organizing Mom's office. Found some business files we need to go through." I almost laughed out loud. Business files in Martha's office. If they only knew that my real business files weren't in that house at all. They were getting nervous. I could tell from the increasingly urgent voicemails Victoria left over the next 3 days. Each message more demanding than the last, each one revealing more about her growing panic. "George, we found some confusing paperwork in Martha's desk. Legal documents that don't make sense. Could you call me back? There might be some things you need to explain." Confusing paperwork. I could only imagine what they'd discovered. Probably the outdated copies Martha kept for appearances. Documents that referenced assets that no longer existed under her name or business relationships that didn't align with their assumptions about our modest lifestyle. I deleted each message without responding. Let them wonder. Let them spend sleepless nights trying to figure out why nothing added up the way they'd expected. On Friday morning, Harold called with news that made me smile for the first time since Martha's funeral. "They've hired an attorney," he said without preamble. "Have they now? Jackson Morrison from Morrison and Associates. Solid reputation, specializes in estate disputes. He's asking questions about Martha's will and requesting a formal reading with all beneficiaries present." I set down my coffee cup, feeling that familiar cold satisfaction spread through my chest. How thoughtful of them to ensure everything is handled properly. "Monday afternoon, 2 p.m. at their attorney's office. They want you there, George. All of them will be present." "Perfect. I'll be there. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Once we walk into that room, there's no going back. They're going to learn exactly who you are. I looked out my hotel window at the ordinary world beyond. People going about their ordinary lives with ordinary problems, ordinary assumptions about how money and power worked in family dynamics. Soon, very soon, I would no longer be invisible to the family that had dismissed me so easily. "Harold, I've been ready for 20 years. That weekend, I went shopping. Not at the discount stores they probably expected a newly poor widower to frequent, but at the boutiques I'd always preferred when Martha wasn't watching the budget for appearances. I chose a charcoal gray suit, elegant but understated, along with the gold watch Martha had given me for our 10th anniversary and my father's cufflinks. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a man of substance who had simply chosen to be underestimated. Sunday evening, I moved out of the Hampton Inn and into the penthouse suite at the Marriott downtown. Just for one night, just to remind myself who I really was before walking into that meeting. I ordered room service steak and wine and reviewed the documents Harold had prepared. Everything was in order. Everything was legal. Everything was about to change. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of weather that matched my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully, arrived at Morrison and Associates 15 minutes early, and settled into the leather chair in their waiting area. The receptionist, a professional woman in her 30s, looked me over with barely concealed curiosity. "You're here for the Thompson estate reading?" she asked, checking her computer screen. "I am." "And you are?" "George Thompson, the widower." Something in my tone made her look up sharply, but before she could respond, voices erupted from down the hall. Loud, confident voices that I recognized immediately. "This should be straightforward," Victoria was saying. The old man never contributed anything significant. Martha was the breadwinner. I listened to them discuss me like I was a footnote in their story, a minor character to be managed and dismissed. They had no idea they were about to meet the author. At exactly 2 p.m. Harold arrived with Catherine Walsh, the power attorney I'd retained for this specific moment. Catherine was everything I'd hoped for, sharp, intimidating, and completely unimpressed by family drama. Behind them came Jackson Morrison himself, a nervous-looking man in his 50s, who seemed overwhelmed by the circumstances he'd been hired to navigate. "Well," Morrison said, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief, "I believe everyone is here now. Shall we proceed?" The conference room felt like a courtroom. The family had arranged themselves on one side like prosecutors, Victoria at the head, flanked by Paul and Linda, with Ronald positioned slightly behind them. They'd dressed for victory, expensive clothes and confident postures, the look of people who expected to inherit everything. I took the seat directly across from them, with Harold and Catherine on either side. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Jackson Morrison cleared his throat and began reading Martha's will in a monotone voice. The standard language about being of sound mind, the formal declarations, the preliminary bequests to charity. Then came the part they'd been waiting for. To my beloved children, Paul, Linda, and Ronald Wau, I leave the sum of $50,000 each to be distributed equally among them. I watched their faces carefully. $50,000 each was generous for most families, but far less than they'd expected. Victoria's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Linda frowned. Paul leaned forward like he'd misheard. "And to my dear husband, George Thompson, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all properties, investments, and personal effects, to be his absolutely and without restriction." The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison continued reading, but I could see that no one was listening anymore. They were all staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to outrage to disbelief. "Excuse me," Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Could you repeat that last part?" Morrison looked uncomfortable. "The bulk of Mrs. Thompson's estate goes to her husband, as is customary in such circumstances." "But what exactly does that include?" Linda asked, her voice rising. "The house, her retirement savings. What are we talking about here?" It was Catherine who answered, consulting her own copy of the will with professional detachment. "According to these documents, Mr. Thompson inherits all real property, all financial accounts, all investments, and all personal property not specifically mentioned elsewhere in the will." "That's impossible," Ronald said flatly. "Mom would never leave us with just $50,000 each." Harold leaned forward slightly. "I'm afraid it's quite legal, Mr. Thompson. Your mother was very specific about her intentions." "But he didn't earn any of it," Victoria exploded, finally losing the composure she'd been struggling to maintain. "He never worked. He never contributed anything. He was just there, living off her success." The words hung in the air like poison. Just there. The same phrase she'd used the night she'd thrown me out of my own home. The same dismissal, the same contempt, the same fundamental misunderstanding of who I really was. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room focus on me. For 18 years, I had let Martha be the face of our family's financial stability. I had allowed people to assume she was the breadwinner while I played the supporting husband. I had been content to remain in the shadows, building my empire quietly while she took the credit publicly. But Martha was gone now, and the shadows had served their purpose. "You're absolutely right, Victoria," I said quietly. "I never contributed anything to Martha's success." She blinked clearly, not expecting agreement. Martha's teaching salary, her pension, her modest savings account, that was all her. I had nothing to do with any of it. I could see confusion rippling across their faces. This wasn't the response they'd expected. "But you see," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "Martha's estate isn't what you think it is, and I'm not who you think I am." Catherine was already reaching into her briefcase, pulling out documents that would change everything. Harold was checking his watch, timing the moment perfectly. "What do you mean?" Paul asked, speaking for the first time since the reading began. I looked at each of them in turn. These people who had dismissed me, who had thrown me out of my own home, who had treated me like a burden to be disposed of. "I mean," I said, allowing myself the smallest smile, that you've been operating under some very expensive assumptions about who owns what in this family. Catherine opened her briefcase with surgical precision. The documents she withdrew were organized in neat folders, each one labeled with the kind of detail that suggested this moment had been planned for a very long time. Perhaps, Catherine said in her crisp, professional voice, we should clarify exactly what constitutes Martha Thompson's estate versus what belongs to her husband. Jackson Morrison shifted uncomfortably. I'm not sure I understand the distinction. The distinction, Harold interjected, is whether Martha actually owned the assets that her family believes they're inheriting. I watched Victoria's confident smirk begin to crack around the edges. Of course she owned them, she said, but there was new uncertainty in her voice. The house, her savings, everything. George never worked, never contributed financially. That's where you're wrong, Catherine interrupted, sliding the first document across the polished table. Mr. Thompson has been the primary owner of virtually every significant asset in this family for over 15 years. The paper landed in front of Victoria with a soft whisper that seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. Victoria picked up the document with trembling fingers. Her face went white as she read the header. George William Thompson, she whispered, her voice barely audible. That's correct, Catherine said smoothly. This is the deed to the property at 42 Maple Drive, the house you've been living in since Mr. Thompson graciously vacated it. Notice the name on the title. George Thompson. Victoria read aloud, her voice cracking. Sole owner since 2009. But that's impossible, Paul stammered, grabbing the paper from his wife's hands. Mom bought that house before she even met George. She did, Harold confirmed calmly. And then she refinanced it in 2008 using capital that Mr. Thompson provided. When the new mortgage was issued, ownership transferred to him as the primary financial backer. What capital? Ronald demanded, finally finding his voice. He never had any money. He lived off Mom's teacher's salary. Catherine smiled, the kind of cold, professional expression that I'd specifically hired her for. Mr. Thompson has maintained substantial assets since before his marriage to your mother. He simply chose not to advertise that fact. The time had come. These people had spent the last week living in my house, sleeping in my beds, planning their futures around my assets. They'd treated me like a discarded inconvenience while dividing up wealth that had never belonged to them. The money came from my first marriage, I said, standing slowly and walking to the window. When my wife died in 1997, she left me with considerable life insurance and investment portfolios. I was 52 years old and worth over $15 million when I met your mother. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. But you never worked, Linda said weakly, like she was clinging to the last piece of her understanding of reality. I didn't need to work in the traditional sense. I managed investments. I bought and sold properties. I made business decisions. I turned back to face them. I just did it quietly. Catherine was already sliding another folder across the table. These are the incorporation papers for Thompson Holdings, LLC, established in 1998. Mr. Thompson is the sole proprietor of a company that currently owns 23 properties across 4 states. Victoria's hand flew to her throat. 23 properties, including 4 apartment complexes in Manhattan, 3 office buildings in Boston, 2 shopping centers in Connecticut, and a recently renovated warehouse in Soho that was appraised last month at $30 million. The number hit the room like a physical force. I watched as the implications sank in, as their understanding of reality shifted and cracked like ice under pressure. 30 million. Paul's voice came out as barely a whisper. That's just one building. That's just one property, Harold added helpfully. Would you like to see the complete portfolio summary? He didn't wait for an answer. Document after document appeared on the table like cards in a high-stakes poker game. Bank statements showing accounts with balances that made Martha's teacher pension look like pocket change. Investment records detailing stock holdings in companies they'd never heard of. Property deeds from Maine to Georgia. The total value of Mr. Thompson's current holdings, Catherine announced, consulting her summary sheet with theatrical precision, is approximately $50 million. This does not include the modest assets he inherited from Martha's estate, which, as we've established, amount to roughly $150,000 in retirement savings and personal effects. $50 million. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Victoria was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not just shock, but something approaching terror. "You're lying," she said, but her voice carried no conviction. "Which part would I be lying about?" I asked pleasantly. "The part where I've been financially independent since before I met Martha, or the part where you've been living in my house, eating food I paid for, and driving cars I helped finance for the past 4 years." "But why didn't Martha ever say anything?" Linda asked, looking genuinely confused rather than angry. "Because I asked her not to." I returned to my seat feeling more relaxed than I had in years. Martha had her pride as an educator. She wanted to be seen as the provider, the responsible parent. I was happy to let her have that image publicly while I handled things privately. "So, when we asked you to leave," Paul said slowly, the full horror of their situation finally dawning on him, "you were actually being evicted from my own home by people who had no legal right to be there." I finished for him. The truth of what they'd done was finally sinking in. I could see it in their faces, the growing realization that they hadn't just been cruel to a helpless widower. They'd been cruel to someone who could destroy them financially without breaking a sweat. "The consulting business you all found so amusing," Catherine continued, clearly enjoying their distress, "was exactly that. A small operation that Mr. Thompson maintained more as a hobby than a necessity. It generated perhaps $30,000 annually. Hardly enough to support the lifestyle you all assumed he was living off Martha's income." "Then how did he pay for everything?" Ronald asked. "He didn't pay for everything," I corrected. "Martha's teaching salary covered groceries, utilities, and day-to-day expenses. But the mortgage payments, property taxes, home insurance, car payments, family vacations, and yes, even some of your college tuition costs, those came from my accounts." Victoria was visibly shaking now, trembling as the full scope of her mistake became clear. "You let us think. I let you reveal exactly who you were," I interrupted. "I didn't force you to throw me out of my own house the night my wife died. I didn't make you call me a burden who never contributed anything. I didn't tell you to treat a grieving widower with contempt and cruelty." Jackson Morrison was looking around the room like he'd stumbled into someone else's nightmare. "I think there may be some misunderstanding here about the nature of these assets." "There's no misunderstanding," Harold said firmly. "Everything is documented legal and has been properly maintained for years. Mr. Thompson was under no obligation to disclose his financial situation to his stepchildren, especially when they made it clear they saw him as a dependent rather than a family member." "But what does this mean for us?" Linda asked, her voice small and frightened. Catherine consulted her papers with deliberate precision. "Legally speaking, you each inherit exactly what your mother left you, $50,000 each. As for your current living situation," she looked directly at Victoria, "you're currently residing in Mr. Thompson's property without his permission. That would technically constitute trespassing." The word hit like a slap across the face. Trespassing. Victoria's face cycled through several colors before settling on a sickly gray. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious," I said, standing up slowly. "You wanted me out of the way so you could claim what you thought was rightfully yours. You succeeded in getting me out of the way. Unfortunately for you, nothing was rightfully yours to begin with." I gathered my briefcase and looked at each of them one final time. These people who had treated me like garbage, who had dismissed my grief and my worth, who had tried to erase me from my own life. "I'll give you 72 hours to remove your belongings from my house," I said quietly. "After that, I'll have you legally evicted." As I walked towards the door, Victoria's voice followed me, high and desperate. "George, please. We can work something out. We're family." I paused at the threshold, my hand on the door handle. "Family," I repeated softly. "You know, Victoria, you're absolutely right. We are family. And you've just taught me exactly what that word means to you." The 72 hours I'd given them turned into the most satisfying 3 days of my life. Not because I enjoyed their suffering, but because for the first time in decades, I was watching people face the real consequences of their choices. The first call came 6 hours after the meeting. Victoria, of course, her voice a mixture of desperation and barely contained rage. "George, we need to talk. This whole situation has gotten out of hand." I was back in my penthouse suite at the Marriott, enjoying a glass of wine and watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold. "Has it?" "I thought we talked quite thoroughly this afternoon. You know what I mean. The house, the money, all of it. There has to be some way to work this out reasonably." "Reasonably? Like how you reasonably threw me out of my own home the night my wife died." Silence on the other end. We were grieving too, George. We weren't thinking clearly. You were thinking clearly enough to have me pack my bags and find somewhere else to live within hours of Martha's funeral. You were thinking clearly enough to start dividing up what you thought was your inheritance. But we're family. No, Victoria. You made it very clear that I'm not family. You called me a burden who never contributed anything, remember? I could hear her sharp intake of breath. She'd hoped I'd forgotten that particular insult. "I didn't mean that the way it sounded. You meant exactly what you said. The only thing you didn't mean was for me to be in a position to do anything about it." I ended the call and blocked her number. The next morning brought Paul to my hotel. The concierge called up to announce him, asking if I wanted to receive visitors. I almost said no, but curiosity got the better of me. He sat across from me in the hotel's elegant lobby, wringing his hands like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. The man was 38 years old, but he looked like he might cry. "George, I'm so sorry about everything. Victoria gets carried away sometimes, and I should have stopped her." "Should have, could have, would have," I said calmly. "But you didn't." "I know, and I regret that. But you have to understand, we thought Mom had left us provided for. We thought the house, everything would be ours to share. And when you thought that your first instinct was to throw me out onto the street." Paul's face flushed. "It wasn't like that. We just thought you'd be more comfortable somewhere smaller, more manageable." "Paul," I said, my voice sharp enough to cut through his rambling, "stop lying to me and to yourself. You wanted me gone so you could have everything without having to consider my needs or feelings." He stared at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. "Victoria said terrible things, yes. But you stood there and let her. You could have defended me. You could have reminded her that I'd been your stepfather for over 20 years, that I'd helped raise you, paid for your education, been there for every important moment in your life." "I'm saying something now," he whispered. "Now that you know I don't need your charity. Now that you realize I'm not the helpless widower you can discard. Your apology isn't about remorse, Paul. It's about fear." He looked up then, and I saw that I was right. His eyes were filled with terror. "What are you going to do to us?" The question hung between us like a blade. What was I going to do? I had the power to destroy them financially, to make their lives as difficult as they'd tried to make mine. I owned properties they could never afford, had connections they couldn't imagine. But looking at Paul, weak, frightened Paul, who'd never had an original thought in his adult life, I realized something important. I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted something much more valuable than revenge. I wanted them to learn. "I'm going to do exactly what I said I would do. You have until tomorrow evening to remove your belongings from my house. After that, I'm changing the locks. And then you're going to figure out how to live your own lives, make your own decisions, and face your own consequences. No more depending on family money that was never really family money to begin with. Paul's shoulders sagged. Victoria's going to lose her mind. Victoria's going to learn that actions have consequences just like you are. The final 24 hours were the most interesting. I had Harold arrange for a locksmith to be ready, and I drove to the house at exactly 6 p.m. on Friday evening to see if they'd honored the deadline. The driveway was full of cars, not just Paul and Victoria's vehicles, but Linda's sedan, Ronald's rental car, even some cars I didn't recognize. As I sat in my Mercedes watching the house, I realized they were having some sort of family meeting about me, presumably strategizing about what to do with the problem I'd become. I walked to the front door and used my key. They hadn't thought to change the locks, probably because it had never occurred to them that I might still have one. The voices from the living room stopped abruptly when they heard the door open. "Hello?" I called out pleasantly. "I hope you don't mind me letting myself in. It is my house, after all." I found them arranged around the living room like a war council. Victoria sat in what had been Martha's favorite chair, still playing the role of matriarch. Paul and Linda flanked her while Ronald hung back near the window. There were two people I didn't recognize, a middle-aged couple who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "George," Victoria said, standing up with forced dignity, "we were hoping you'd come by. We wanted to discuss a reasonable settlement to this whole misunderstanding." Settlement. I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For the house. Obviously, Paul and I have put a lot of work into this place. A lot of improvements. We think we deserve some compensation for our investment." "You think you deserve compensation for living in my house rent-free for a week?" The unknown couple exchanged glances. The woman cleared her throat nervously. "Perhaps we should go, Victoria. This seems like a private family matter." "No, please stay," I said warmly. "I'm George Thompson, Martha's husband. And you are?" "Tom and Linda Patterson," the man said reluctantly. "We're Victoria's parents." So they'd brought in reinforcements. Victoria's parents probably told some version of events that painted me as the villain in this story. "How lovely to meet you," I said. "I hope Victoria has explained the situation accurately." Tom Patterson looked between his daughter and me with obvious confusion. "She said there was some sort of dispute about Martha's will, about who gets what." "There's no dispute," I said calmly. "The will is very clear. Martha left modest bequests to her children and everything else to me. The only complication is that most of what people assumed was Martha's property was actually mine all along." Linda Patterson frowned. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "Neither did they until a few days ago. You see, I've been financially independent since before I married Martha. The house they've been living in belongs to me. The comfortable lifestyle they've been enjoying was funded by my assets, not Martha's teacher salary." I watched the older couple process this information, watched their expressions change as they realized their daughter might not have been entirely truthful about the circumstances. "But Victoria said you never worked," Linda said slowly. "I didn't need to work in the traditional sense. I managed a rather substantial investment portfolio." I smiled pleasantly. "About $50 million worth, as it turns out." The silence that followed was profound. Tom Patterson's mouth actually fell open. "So when your daughter threw me out of this house the night Martha died," I continued conversationally, "she was essentially evicting me from my own property. When she called me a burden who never contributed anything, she was speaking to someone who had been supporting the entire family for years." Victoria's face had gone white. Her parents were staring at her with expressions of horror and disbelief. "Victoria Marie Patterson," her mother said, in the tone of voice that probably hadn't been used since Victoria was 12 years old. "Please tell me you didn't actually throw this man out of his own house at his wife's funeral." "It's complicated, Mom. It's not complicated at all, I said gently. Your daughter made assumptions about my financial situation and treated me accordingly. She's now learning that assumptions can be expensive. Tom Patterson stood up, his face red with embarrassment. Mr. Thompson, on behalf of our family, I want to apologize. If Victoria did what you're saying, then she was raised better than that and should know better. As Victoria's parents gathered their things and headed for the door, I could see the final pillar of her support system crumbling. She'd counted on them to back her up, to see her as the victim in this situation. Instead, they'd seen her for what she really was. 20 minutes, I announced to the room as the front door closed. Then I'm changing the locks whether you're finished or not. They scrambled, then grabbing bags and boxes they'd obviously packed in preparation for this confrontation. Linda and Ronald avoided eye contact as they carried their belongings to their cars. Paul moved like a man in a trance, loading suitcases with mechanical precision. But Victoria stood in the center of the living room, staring at me with something approaching hatred. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied, equally quiet. "It is." She left without another word, and I watched from the window as the cars pulled out of my driveway one by one. When the last tail light disappeared around the corner, I called Harold. "It's done," I told him. "They're gone. How do you feel?" I considered the question as I walked through my house, really looked at it for the first time since Martha's death. It felt different now, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted from the very walls. "I feel free," I said finally. 6 months after that final confrontation, I was sitting in my garden watching the sunrise paint my roses pink and gold when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. These days I was much more selective about who I allowed into my peaceful mornings. But the number looked familiar, and curiosity won out over caution. "Mr. Thompson, this is Dr. Elizabeth Carter at Mercy General Hospital. I have a patient here asking for you." My blood ran cold. "Who?" "Paul Thompson. He's listed you as his emergency contact. He said to tell you it's important." Emergency contact. After everything that had happened, after the way his family had treated me, Paul had still listed me as the person to call in a crisis. Despite myself, I felt a familiar pang of paternal concern. "What happened?" "Car accident. He's stable, but he's asking for you specifically." 20 minutes later, I was walking through the sterile corridors of Mercy General, my footsteps echoing against the polished floor. I'd changed out of my gardening clothes into something more appropriate, a simple blue shirt that Martha had always liked paired with the watch she'd given me for our anniversary. I found Paul in a private room, his left leg in a cast and his arm in a sling, but otherwise looking remarkably well for someone who'd apparently wrapped his car around a tree. "George," his voice was soft, relieved. "You came." "Of course I came. You're hurt." He tried to sit up straighter and winced. "The nurse said they couldn't reach Victoria. Her phone's been disconnected." I wasn't surprised. In the months since they'd been forced out of my house, I'd heard through the small-town gossip network that Paul and Victoria's marriage had imploded spectacularly. Apparently, learning that your financial security was built on lies and assumptions had put considerable strain on their relationship. "Where is she now?" I asked, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside his bed. "Gone. She left 3 months ago, took what was left of our savings, and moved back in with her parents." Paul stared at the ceiling, his voice hollow. "She said she married me for the lifestyle, not for me. When the lifestyle disappeared, so did she." "I'm sorry, Paul. Are you—" He turned to look at me, and I was startled by the clarity in his eyes. "Even after everything we did to you?" I considered the question seriously. Was I sorry? 6 months ago, I would have said that Victoria leaving was exactly what Paul deserved. But looking at him now, broken alone, finally forced to confront the consequences of his choices, I found that I was genuinely sad for him. "Yes," I said simply. "I'm sorry you're going through this." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the hospital around us. Finally, Paul spoke again. "I need to tell you something about that night when Victoria threw you out." "Paul, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice was stronger now, more determined than I'd heard it in years. "I knew it was wrong. Even as it was happening, I knew it was cruel and unfair. But I was so angry about the will, so disappointed that Mom had left us so little, that I let Victoria convince me you were the problem." He paused, struggling with words that had obviously been weighing on him for months. "You raised me, George. From the time I was 15 years old, you were more of a father to me than my biological father ever was. You came to my soccer games, helped me with homework, stayed up with me when I was sick. You paid for my college, helped me with my first apartment, walked me through every major decision in my life." Tears were sliding down his cheeks now, and I felt my own throat tighten with emotion. "And the night Mom died, when I should have been protecting you and comforting you, I let my wife call you names and throw you out onto the street. I've been living with that guilt for 6 months, and I needed you to know that I remember who you really are." I reached over and took his uninjured hand in mine. "Oh, Paul." "I don't expect you to forgive me," he continued. "I just needed you to know that I see now what I threw away. Not the money or the inheritance or any of that. I threw away the one person in my life who loved me unconditionally." The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. "You didn't throw me away, son. You made a mistake. A terrible, hurtful mistake, but not an unforgivable one." He squeezed my hand weakly. "How can you say that after what we did? Because I understand something now that I didn't 6 months ago. That night, when Victoria threw me out, I thought my world was ending. I thought I was losing my family, my home, everything that mattered. But what I was really losing was an illusion." Paul frowned, not understanding. "I thought I was part of a loving family, where everyone cared about each other. But the truth was, I was part of a system where my value was based on what I could provide, not who I was. That night forced me to see the difference." I adjusted my grip on his hand, choosing my words carefully. "You and your siblings and Victoria, you didn't know me at all. You knew the role I played, the function I served, but you never bothered to find out who I really was underneath. And because you didn't know me, you couldn't really love me. You loved what I did for you." Paul was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. "And now," he asked finally, "now you're seeing me for the first time as a complete person, someone with his own history, his own strength, his own worth, that exists independently of what I can do for others." I smiled at him through my tears. "And I'm seeing you clearly too, Paul. Not as Martha's son or Victoria's husband, but as the young man I helped raise, who's finally learning to take responsibility for his choices." So where does that leave us? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since the doctor's call that morning. Where did it leave us? I had every right to walk away from this family permanently. I had every justification for letting them live with the consequences of their cruelty without interference from me. But sitting in that hospital room holding the hand of the boy I'd helped raise, I realized that revenge and justice weren't the same thing. Justice had been served. They'd learned the truth about their assumptions and faced the natural consequences. Revenge would be withholding forgiveness from someone who was genuinely trying to make amends. "It leaves us here," I said finally. "Starting over if you want to. Building a relationship based on who we actually are instead of who we thought we were supposed to be." Paul's eyes filled with fresh tears. "You'd be willing to do that after everything?" "I'd be willing to try. But it would be different this time, Paul. I'm not going to be the invisible man who makes everything work behind the scenes. I'm not going to pretend to be less than I am to make other people comfortable. I wouldn't want you to. And I'm not going to rescue you from the consequences of your choices. If you want a relationship with me, you have to build it yourself, maintain it yourself, and value it for what it is, not for what it might get you." Paul nodded solemnly. "I understand." Do you? Because this isn't about money or inheritance or anything material. This is about two adults choosing to care about each other, despite a very painful history. I know. And I want that, George. I want to know you, the real you, not the version I created in my head. I studied his face, looking for any sign that this was manipulation or desperation talking. But what I saw was something I'd never seen from Paul before, genuine remorse and a determination to do better. Then we'll try, I said slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries and honest communication. Relief washed over his features. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to be hard work, Paul. Unlearning 20 years of bad habits and assumptions isn't easy. I'm ready for hard work. These past 6 months have taught me I'm stronger than I thought I was. I squeezed his hand one more time, then stood up to leave. I'm going to go talk to your doctor about your discharge plans. Do you have somewhere to go when you get out of here? I've been staying in a studio apartment downtown. It's not much, but it's mine. Good. Independence suits you. As I walked toward the door, Paul's voice stopped me. George, what about Linda and Ronald? Do you think they might? I turned back to him. That's up to them, son. My door is open, but they have to choose to walk through it just like you did. And Victoria? I considered this carefully. Victoria, who had initiated the cruelty that started this whole mess. Victoria, who had shown no remorse, no recognition of wrongdoing, only anger at being caught in her assumptions. Victoria burned that bridge herself, I said quietly. Some actions have consequences that can't be undone. She chose to reveal her character, and now she has to live with what she revealed. Paul nodded, understanding the distinction. I left him there in his hospital bed, looking more peaceful than I'd seen him since he was a child. The walk back to my car felt different, somehow lighter, like I was carrying less weight than when I'd walked in. That evening I sat in my garden again, as the sun set behind my roses. My phone had rung twice more. Linda and Ronald probably having heard about Paul's accident through the family network. I'd let both calls go to voicemail, but I'd listen to the messages later. Tentative voices, awkward apologies, requests to talk. The first signs that the family I'd thought I'd lost forever might be reconsidering their assumptions about who I was and what I was worth. I'd call them back tomorrow maybe, or maybe I'd wait and see if they called again. Either way, I was no longer in a hurry. I had time, resources, and for the first time in decades, complete control over my own life. The invisible man was gone forever, replaced by someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. Someone who could choose forgiveness or distance engagement or solitude based on what felt right rather than what was expected. And that, I reflected as I watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, was worth more than $50 million. Though the $50 million didn't hurt. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. I learned that being underestimated can be your greatest advantage. When people judge you by appearances rather than substance, they reveal more about themselves than you. True power lies not in what others see, but in what you choose to show them. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from allowing others to mistake your quiet confidence for weakness until the moment you decide to remind them otherwise. Thank you for watching until here.